To speak. Can everybody see the slide? Are they visible?
Yes.
Great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about reinforcement learning in the off-policy situation. And this is based on a course that I recently developed and taught at University of North Carolina in the fall 2019 semester. The course was entitled Precision Medicine, and it included a range of topics on dynamic treatment regimes and related aspects, and included many types of dynamic treatment regime estimation approaches, including reinforcement learning, both finite, infinite horizon settings, and a number of other topics, including deep learning and various other things that are useful for precision medicine. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Q&A learning, which are two very useful and widely used approaches in off-policy finite horizon Q learning. First, just a brief introduction. When I use the term precision medicine, sometimes people think of various things, but what I'm referring to is about a 10-year-old plus discipline that's been emerging in statistics and machine learning that focuses on the development of decision support, or algorithms that take the context of the patient as measured through their covariates and provide an optimal treatment recommendation based on data. This is been studied for a long time, and it's widely accepted, but it is not widely understood. And we'll be talking today about the multi-stage setting. But in this case, it's instead of a single rule for when a patient might present and need treatment, this is for a disease and chronic disease settings and other disease settings where there's multiple treatments. And sometimes a goal is to sort of improve on the previous treatment or continue to do better and better. Cancer chemotherapy is an example. We'll look at other examples. But in this case, you have a finite set of decisions. And you want to take into account delayed effects of early treatment, and you want to look at the overall impact of these results on the outcome of the patient, and then do something that is going to be statistically valid in the sense that it will be reproducible and likely to work on future patients. And the structure of a multi-decision setting mirrors clinical practice, where a physician would meet with a patient, give them a treatment, and perhaps meet with them again at a prescribed later time, or if something happens, and then look at their situation and give them a new treatment. And this is the idea of the decision support we want to provide with reinforcement learning in this setting. In biomedical research involving humans, we really have to use off-policy reinforcement learning, which some of you may be familiar with, but not everybody. And the idea here, basic idea here, is we cannot afford to have the treatment paths, all the treatment paths experienced by each of the patients or each of the contexts. We have to use inference to determine optimality. In some studies, even very well-designed studies, it's possible that very few, if any, patients will actually get the optimal treatment, but we'll have the data we need to infer what that is for future patients. If we are doing these studies are well-designed and we're using the proper analytical tools. So I'm going to look at these situations. And infinite horizon would be something where there's a continual series of decisions that are made over time. This could be, for example, monitoring type 1 diabetes patients, helping them control their blood sugar. They always have to have it within a certain range. And there are other examples in biomedicine and outside of biomedicine for infinite horizon. But finite horizon has some special things that we can do that we really can't quite do in infinite horizon setting. So I want to formalize the multi-decision setting here a little bit, define the corresponding statistical problem, and then briefly describe Q learning and A learning at a high level, but I'll give some technical details. And then I want to contrast briefly these two approaches, what's different about them. And so I just want to mention a couple of clinical examples that I think are relevant to look at here. One is some work we did looking at ways to treat patients who have had severe burns in a plastic surgery clinic. The goal here is to use various kinds of treatment, including 2 different kinds of lasers, carbon dioxide and pulse dye lasers, which actually affect different parts of the tissue when they're repairing. And the goal is to repair and improve these very severe burns that are life debilitating. And this is a study that was very enthusiastically supported by patients. I will say that an unfortunate thing that happened is that an insurance company determined that this study, that they would no longer pay for this, because they didn't like the idea of randomization, even though the clinicians did not know exactly what was best and felt there was absolutely no, there would be no less performance if they use randomization versus otherwise, because they actually don't know for sure. But they didn't like it. The person who was making the decision was not a scientist. And so we had to stop the study before we accrued patients. However, it did go through IRB approval and was funded, and we did publish the design so that it could be used hopefully at some future date when we're able to find insurance companies who are willing to work with randomized studies. The second example is a study that is based on nutrition that I don't have a paper yet, but it was funded and is completing right now. We're finished accruing patients, we're collecting follow-up data, and we're about to start the analysis. And in this one, we're looking at type 1 diabetic patients, and we are trying to give them diets that will help them control their blood sugar and also be able to help them lose weight. One of the challenges in type 1 diabetic patients is that because of the discomfort and misery of low blood sugar, there's sometimes a fear of not eating enough. And so dieting one has to be a little bit careful with dieting because it can lead to dangerous situations. And so these diets have to be carefully crafted and considered. And so the idea here is there are 3 basic diet strategies, and the patient would try these in sequence with random choices of them. And if one didn't work, they'd be randomized to a new one after a certain period of time. If it did work, they'd stay on the previous one. And there were a couple pragmatic aspects of the study, including that if a patient was about to be randomized to a diet they've already tried before but didn't like, we would give them a different diet. And so this is a very interesting design that really does help answer the question, because the clinician would actually be meeting these patients, trying a diet. If that doesn't work, trying something else. And so the case of a dynamic treatment regime is really important here. And a randomized smart design is really important. All of us know that observational data can also give us insight in some situations, but depending on the question we're asking, sometimes a well-designed smart can boost power or the sample size requirements. We can do with 1,000-fold less patients in a well-designed smart design compared to observational data. And sometimes that number 1,000 is much larger than that. So these are highly efficient. In some cases, there are questions we can answer in smart design that we can't even answer in an observational study. So I want to just mention that one of the very important things about reinforcement learning is the data you have. And if you have good design data, it makes a huge difference. And sometimes it makes a problem that is impossible to estimate to one that is possible. Having said that, observation data can still be very useful. Okay, a couple papers and resources that may be helpful. Eric Laber and I recently had a review paper on precision medicine that came out in, just a moment. In the annual reviews of statistics and its application, that gives a high-level idea of dynamic treatment regimes and all sorts of related aspects and in the context of precision medicine, and helps clarify this discipline or help organize it. There are many contributors to this discipline, but I think it's very important that more structure be given to it. Also, a very important paper that Eric Laber was a co-author on from 2014 that precisely describes contrasts Q&A learning, statistical science publication. And also, if you're interested, my course, Biostatistics 740, if you go to this website here, that's basically my personal webpage, just a teaching and mentoring, scroll down to the Biostatistics 740, the syllabus and all the lectures and all other course material is there. And it covers, reinforcement learning is a very important part of precision health, and it's covered in there, as well as many other topics. But that could be a very useful class if you're interested in the bigger context of dynamic treatment regimes and related areas. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the framework. So we're going to introduce some notation. And so let capital K be the number of decision times that we have in this setting. An example, if we're looking at clinical, at non-small cell lung cancer, phase 4, one would typically have 2 or 3 stages. I say the or 3 because sometimes the third stage is very rare and really depends on what was given earlier, but there are often typically 2 stages. That's a very simple example. It's just barely more than 1, but it's very importantly different because reinforcement learning is needed. With one decision point, you can use regression model, education, and other tools, but when there's more than one, you have no choice but to use some type of reinforcement learning if you want to get a valid answer. But typically this K is known in advance by the nature of the treatment setting and the clinical setting of interest. And we'll also use the setting that we have a final outcome Y of interest. And this is one way to present it. One can actually have an accruing outcome as well that accrues each time. But there's some unique things about a final outcome. In the case of the surgery, plastic surgery example I gave later, the treatment and the smart design itself was going to take place, the sequence of treatments was going to take place within a 1-year period. And then 1 year later, we were looking at an outcome, which is, did this repair lead to healing and long-term benefits? And so this makes a lot of sense in a lot of these clinical settings, but there can be settings where you might be accruing. An example might be time to event data, where you would obviously accrue survival time to survival, length of survival time. You would be accruing that as you march along in your study. But this is different than infinite horizon, where you wouldn't necessarily have one outcome of interest measured at one time. Typically, you're trying to keep something, you're trying to maximize something continually or keep things within a certain boundary of safety. But we'll do this Y. It's very useful context for many of these studies, and there are extensions for the other types, but we'll focus on that version. And in the similar with, but in the diet example I gave there, we're actually looking at weight loss at each of the time points, but our final endpoint at the end is overall weight loss. So that also can be viewed as accrued outcome. We'll use omega and little omega in the standard statistical way to represent the population. The idea here is that we're very concerned about our results being applicable to a future population that we don't yet have observed. And so that means that we have to consider that population as we develop reinforcement learning to make sure our results are transportable to that population. In the easiest setting, we assume that we're sampling or looking at patients from the same population of patients we'll want to apply this to, even if these patients will not be involved necessarily in the future applications. So at the first look, a patient presents and they have various baseline data from their medical records at the time of presentation, and the physician makes an initial treatment assessment. We'll use S to denote the data available of a patient at any time point. S1 is the one at the first decision time. And the reason you like to use decision points or time interchangeably is that these may not be evenly spaced. They may be unevenly spaced, they may be spaced by plan. They could also be dependent on a particular endpoint. For example, in cancer, the second look may happen if a person has a recurrence of the cancer, or it could be that it happens for other reasons. In both the examples I gave you, those times are scheduled by the clinician. Okay, so, and then script S we'll use to include this to describe the state, the range of possible values. So in our context, unlike in a lot of state space evaluations in finite time, we're not looking at finite state spaces. These are Euclidean dimensional or higher. So these are infinite dimensional state spaces. So at each decision point, we'll assume that there's a finite set of treatments, which will denote alpha script A, and an element of that will be AK. And so these treatments could vary. Often with chemotherapy, the agents you might consider would be different, but they could also be the same possibility. And we'll use a bar to denote the history up to that time. And we'll use Cartesian product. X is a Cartesian product. And so this curly A bar is all the possible sequences of treatments between 1 and K. Capital K. Little k will be the particular time point. Capital K is the total number. Okay, now potential outcomes. This is an important aspect of off-policy learning. It's actually quite central. The idea being that we're not going to be able to try every action for each of these individuals we're studying, but that there exists potential outcomes that could be different, lead them to different paths in their future based on those treatments. And so we want to say that we have a patient presenting, and then that patient at time 1 has many possible paths that are determined by the treatments that are given going forward. And there might be additional stochastic elements which are not included in this, but that those largely, and those may be unmeasurable frailties or whatever, but that really describes well what's happening in the population context. So once we condition on individual state, there's a population of possibilities, but there's also a population of individuals, and then there's a big population that includes all of these possibilities. Okay, so the potential outcomes, W star is all of the, S1 is fixed because that's known for this patient, right? But there are all these future possibilities, which are their state, capital S, at these future time points, and the different treatments that they're given. For each possible sequence of treatments, we'd have different potential outcomes. The idea of these exist. We won't see them. We'll only get to see one for that patient, but that they exist, and that this idea can be used to help us infer what will happen, how to get the optimal treatment, even if nobody gets it. The idea being is that we'll have a bunch of patients who are getting treatments that are close to what will likely be given, and we have a bunch of patients who are similar to the patients that we'll see. So any given patient there'll be some patient who is similar, at least at certain time points to them, and who got certain treatments. And this can be shown to be, with a little more precision to that statement, can be shown to be sufficient to actually get valid estimates of these, reproducibly valid estimates of the decision rules. And so that's really the concept here. We have these potential outcomes, and we have the potential that are the states, and then we have the potential final outcome Y. These are all related because the state of a patient could be very well an important consequence of the treatment that they're getting. And you can think of as Y as new information is accrued after the last state, or you could think of it as combination of a summary taken from all of the states the patient experiences. But Y itself is a potential outcome. And for now, we're going to assume instead of the future outcome having all the state information, we just have a single number Y, which measures the final outcome that we're interested in. And so while we really we're going to care about optimizing this Y, finding that sequence, we have to deal with these states that are also potential outcomes along the way because they factor into how we determine A. And so we use a star to indicate potential outcomes, meaning these are possible treatments that they might get, possible states they might achieve based on different possible treatments. And bar again denotes a sequence, the past history of that. So what is a dynamic treatment regime? Well, this is a sequence of rules or algorithms that are fixed. Eventually, we want to get to, there are many possibilities, but our goal is to find the best one. And these are fixed functions of the state at time K, D1, where the index little k from k equals 1 to capital K, information available. And we're going to talk about what that information might be, but these are algorithms that take that information available and then tell the clinician what is the best treatment. That's our goal, is to figure that out. And though this is real decision support, I just want to take a moment to say that in a lot of work in precision in machine learning, the focus is on prediction or clustering. I think it's really important to highlight that this is very different than that and goes well beyond prediction. I like to think of prediction as having three basic stages of increasing difficulty. The first stage is to try to predict what's going to happen just as we follow this patient. You can think of that as prognostic prediction. A lot of energy is spent worldwide on that question. The second question that's much harder is, okay, we have a prediction model, but now I want it to be causally valid, so if I change a treatment, I can predict what will happen if I change that patient's treatment. That's causal validity that's much more difficult than just doing prediction. But then the most difficult of all is to not only figure out what will happen to the treatment, but figure the optimal sequence of treatments that will happen as the patient unfolds. That's very, very difficult because it includes a rich optimization that can be very, very non-trivial. So our goal is to do this, and as you might suspect, this is the hard thing to do. And this is why this is not as widely understood, I think, as regular prediction, because there's a lot of richness that has to be addressed. And so by nature, it's not an easy problem. But I do think I'm hoping that in my presentation today, I can provide a little clarity to some of this. So it's dynamic in two ways. One, it's dynamic because these decision rules are designed to actually adapt. Even though they're fixed, they are functions of history, and that history is changing. So what actually is realized in these dynamic regime is completely adapts to the environment very effectively. This just gives, the algorithm spells out how it's adapting. It's also dynamic in the sense that each patient has different stages. So there's not one path based on what's happened in the past for each patient. It depends highly on the patient's characteristics. So it's dynamic in that it adapts to each individual and it adapts over time. So it's dynamic in two ways. Another point I want to make, there may be a class of treatments that we consider, but based on clinical conditions or clinical context, there may only be a couple of treatments that are actually feasible for that patient. For example, they might be allergic to a particular drug that's one of the ones under consideration. Well, that patient should not be given that drug, right? And there are other reasons. And so what we do is working with the clinicians and other health professionals, we would figure out, based on any of the possible states a patient would go to, what are the set of feasible treatments for this patient? What are allowable treatments? This may not be, depending on what you're doing, this may not be as difficult as it sounds. We've been working through these with a number of projects, and it's quite realistic to do, and there's a lot of known knowledge to allow for this. And so at the case decision point, we have to not only look at the treatments that are available, but we have to look at the treatments that are feasible or appropriate for that patient. And so psi-k is sort of our little function that's a set function, it gets set valued function that for the state that we're in and considering to give the next treatment, based on our current status of the patient plus historical history of the treatments, what are the allowable ones, which will be a subset of the curly A. Now I want to say, reminder here is notice the function dk is a function of sk bar and ak minus 1 bar. When we're viewing this as when a clinician's ready to make a decision, they've collected their current vital data and we've gotten their state value at the current time point k. We also have their past state, and we'll include that as data that's available because that could be capture structure and frailties and strengths that we don't otherwise observe with the current measurements. But we want to make a decision at AK, so we don't know that yet, but we will have available the past K-1 and before treatment choices. So that's why our decisions are always made with this information. So this is what goes into the algorithm. At each decision time, you collect SK, and you've already collected SK-1, so you measure the patient's information, which is usually done before a clinician makes a decision, usually measures the state of that patient. And then you look at the past treatment, and then with all of that information, you use that for your algorithm. So it's really able to adapt. Okay. Well, in the treatment in the first time point, k equals 1, there is no prior treatments, but there is the current state. And there might still be a reason, and there often is, that we would want to restrict the possible treatments there, like allergies, for example, I mentioned. So psi-1 is important, but it's only a function of S1 because we don't know the treatment yet. For the first decision, we only know their current state for this particular disease process we're looking at. Okay. And the next concept I want to say is that because of these restrictions on the possible treatments as we march through, there's a restriction on the possible states. So there's only certain data and certain subsets of the possible potential outcomes and so on that we'll be able to consider. And there's only certain subsets of the treatment. And so we will call gamma K as the data that we have, the range of possible data choices we have available at time K. You can think of it all the possible realizations of covariate treatment history, which having followed the size specifications, the specifications of the restrictions for that patient. Okay, so then the class D of regimes that are feasible is a set of all possible decision rules, index K equals 1 to capital K, that are a mapping of the possible state and history of action variables gamma K into psi K, but considering only, into AK, but only considering the psi K choices that are available. So that's a lot of extra layers, but it's very important that we keep that in mind because that's really important for practical application in these settings. Okay.
Michael,
so,
can I interrupt you for a sec?
Sure.
Go back to the slide because I think there is a question we probably want to answer right now. It's kind of a technical question. So it says, how does reinforcement learning solve JKO, which I'm not sure what does that mean.
Solving gamma K, you mean?
If you see the chat window, there is a question.
Okay, let me see. I have to, how do I go when I have full screen here? I'll stop sharing temporarily.
Just
okay. What is JKO? Is that gamma? Is that gamma there? I don't know what JKO means, but is it asking if how reinforcement will be able to solve this? Let me just try to answer that question, just generally trying to guess what the question is. Really, when we're doing the estimation, we put these constraints in the process. We're going to talk about how reinforcement actually is applied in just a moment. I'm just talking about the ingredients. But basically, we will be following clinical rules that require us to be careful about which treatments are available at each time point. And we will be collecting, this algorithm will be estimated. And the way that we would do this is often different aspects of this are modeled through regression type models or random forest or other things. And we set the problem up, as we'll see later, so that it's some well-defined estimation procedures will get the things we need. So ultimately our goal is to estimate D, get the optimal D estimated decision rule, but I'm giving you the ingredients of the underlying thing. We only observe one potential outcome, but the theoretical existence of these other ones is important because we want to infer the optimal treatment. So I'll try to answer that question as I go along, how this solves it, and I'll try to give a little idea when I outline the steps that are actually used. Right now I'm just giving the structure of the data. So these are just the data that we see or that we might see, and the restrictions we're going to have to place on our process, on our decision making. I haven't talked about how to solve any of this yet.
So I guess so if you ask a question, if you want to be more specific, that would be great. And we can wait until you finish your question. And since we're just making a pause, how about let's just answer the other question?
Oh, okay. Let me look at those.
Yeah, so there's a question, does every individual have the same decision points, not necessarily every space, evenly spaced?
So here's a good question. The way that we would often do this, and we've thought about this, is that they're not necessarily evenly spaced. They would have the same potential points, but there might be a reason that they would stop going on. And so in cancer chemotherapy, there might, as I mentioned, there's sometimes 2 or 3. If things are going well, the patient may not ever need to go to stage 3. And so sometimes, usually what we think about here is they usually will get they'll get the first and the first few, but there might be later stages that some patients won't get at for various reasons. They could even die before they get there. And so usually we think of it as there's the same type of decision points that are defined for each of these. Their spacing may be different, but not every patient will reach all of them. They'll usually get to the first several. They won't skip any, but they'll get to this first several. Typically, we don't expect any skipping here. I hope that answers the question. Any other?
There is one. How does reinforcement learning solve small data fit problem in medical diagnosis?
So that's a good question. When we're doing this, we're usually using observational data, and we usually have a study where we've already collected the data. And usually for these kind of things, to do a good job, to estimate this, you need a couple hundred, range of a couple hundred. To do a good job to estimate sample size based on pilot data, you need somewhere around 40 or 50 patients. And so, yes, it's nice that you can use small data here. And the way that it works is that typically these are somewhat equivalent to regression or classification problems. And if you use the right tool, i.e. probably not deep learning, but something like a version of logistic regression, say with elastic net fit or a random forest can work. When you're dealing with a couple hundred, you can often do tremendous work with that, as long as the number of actions you have is finite, like less than 2 or 3 or so per decision time. But as you get larger and larger, you need bigger and bigger samples. In a smart design, interestingly, you still only need a couple hundred to do a really good job because of the power differential. But we're not trying to do deep learning here, where you often need a lot more higher dimension. We're usually trying to use more traditional or smaller sample size tools for the individual steps within reinforcement learning. Hopefully that answers that question.
I also want to just give a 1 or 2 sentences for the discussion of question 1 to 3 in terms of small data fit and also the decision time points. So I know for example, mobile health application, usually there are not many trajectory, not many subjects. We have recently worked out a very nice bi-directional asymptotics that is under MDP assumption. So either time goes to infinity or subjects n goes to infinity, either goes to infinity, we can all have a nice asymptotic result. That means even if you may have only 1 subject, we still can get a theoretically valid asymptotic. That means you can, for small sample problem, as long as you have long enough trajectory, certainly that's for infinite horizon, you can still make that work. And also,
yeah, and actually you can do it for just, as you said, just for 1 person. If you have enough length and there's a reasonable amount of exploration, you can get consistency for just 1 individual.
Yeah, just one last sentence.
Over time, as long as it keeps going long enough.
For the question of if every subject need to have the same decision points, I don't think you need that, as Michael explained. I just also want to say that I think the decision time can be stochastic, but it should not contain the information. I mean, the decision time should be sort of independent with the reward. Otherwise, you may have an informative decision time point, and that may cause trouble for your inference.
So, and we're working on an extension in the finite horizon case where it can depend on the outcome and be interconnected. But that paper we hope to submit in about a month. So that's an open question, but you can do that under certain considerations if you have the proper type of filtration in your process study, where you feel that the measured data you have contains enough information to have some of the censoring and other things be sufficiently independent and the timing of it be independent. But you can allow there to be a pretty strong dependence between the time of the decision and the outcome, but it has to be very carefully done. So
let's just do one last question, then we should move on because it's already 11:36 here. So last question.
Okay.
For now, you can still ask questions in the window, but Michael just asked the last question for now. So how to deal with the dynamic environment? It's quite a general question.
Okay, so that's a good question. For us, the environment here is the patient's state to some degree. And if you're saying, though, if you're asking about infinite horizon, so finite horizon, we're not really usually dealing with a dynamic environment. Also, we don't have this, we have to have a number of patients large. They're only going to go out a couple time points, so we can't use that information per se. And also the data available changes over time. But in the infinite horizon case, right now the theory that I'm aware of requires the dynamics to be relatively locally similar, but they kick in pretty quickly, so they actually work if things are slowly changing. But there is an open question about what if the dynamics actually changes over time slowly. What can you do to have an exploration approach that will work in the off-policy setting? So I think that's possible. We just haven't. I don't think that problem's been fully worked out. I'm not sure if answering the question, but that's how I would. That's my attempt at answering it.
Okay, so let's really need to move back. So Michael,
Okay.
we wrap up in 20 minutes so that you can still have maybe 3 minutes for discussion near the end.
Yeah. I'm just want to talk about these things a little bit. Optimal. So the idea of optimal regimes. First, I want to talk about just a high level. Backward, how do we look at the optimality of the regime? What really an optimal regime, the opt here, is usually going to be based on conditioning at the initial state, although it adapts later on. But it's in the single stage setting. It's very simple. We just have what decision rule algorithm applied to S1 gives us the expected outcome that's best for those individuals. The point to make is it's optimal for each individual, at least when their individuality is measured by the value of S1. There might be other factors we can't consider because we didn't measure them, but for those that we consider, this is optimal for all of those individuals. So that's an important definition. And this extends to the multiple decision setting. And really, I'm going to skip this slide because I think that I want to get to the underlying idea. And that is here, sorry, just one. Well, so the idea is going to be that the same is true. We actually want it to be, this to be optimal, but now we're looking at this as the expectation of the outcome, given that you have the regime now has specifications for the future states, okay, in the multi-state situation, but we're still conditioning on the initial state of the patient to look at the optimality. We want it to be still optimal over all possible sequences of decision rules for that particular patient at that S1. This allows us to view these as optimal at the individual level and at the population level. So that's an important point that we're trying to, that's our goal, and under certain conditions we can do that. So the idea of backward induction is a key to all of this. So we're going to look at how this is done being this particular type of dynamic programming, and we're going to look at identification estimation. Now, what I'm going to try to do is sort of give a high level here. I have a little more details than I want to provide, but let's now look at the last time point. So the idea, here I'll give you a high level. What you're going to do is you have your data now collected after your study or observational study, which has your has what you're thinking about, and how you do this in a smart design. This would all be designed out. The study would be designed in advance. You'd have your PSI worked out with clinicians, and you have feasibility. Everybody is only feasible treatments were given. We didn't give anybody treatment they were allergic to, and so on. And we'd have that data collected, gathered, and ready to go. And that'll be. But if it's observational data, sometimes we don't know whether we can actually do these analyses. And so one has to do an analysis where we check feasibility, we estimate propensity score, which tells us the distribution conditional on these variables as we go forward, and we would examine the estimated propensity score and the feasibility rules to see what kind of treatments we could actually ask questions about in that data set. Because it turns out there may be many treatments that are only given once or have some other aspect about them. And I'm going to give a little digression here. One example of a project that I'm working on involves COVID-19. And many hospitals, including the one that we're working with, has been treating this. The clinicians get together and develop an algorithm that uses their patient's initial state to determine how to treat them. And they use that using best research. Well, the problem with that for our endeavor is that everybody at a certain state is getting one and only one treatment. There's no other treatment options. So we can't compare different treatments for similar patients. And so an interesting feature about this hospital that may make it work is that they change their algorithm fairly frequently. So there are a number of these algorithms. Now, what we have to do is use propensity score analysis to evaluate whether there's enough change and there's enough mixture there that we have enough ability to actually estimate these sort of decision rules, but we won't know. So if somebody uses the algorithm, it almost makes the observational data completely useless. If they use the same algorithm, then your question's actually impossible to answer. So this is why, again, designing and thinking about this is very, very important before trying to do this kind of analysis. Okay, so here's the basic idea. At the last look, we want to look at what is the best treatment given the previous states. Now, at this point, all the treatments have already given. We can't affect the past, but we can take what treatments have been given to these patients and we can look at their current state. What we then do is we try to, our goal is to then look at the outcome that they would get if we give them treatment AK and they get the other history that we already have. So AK is the only flexible part here. We look for the maximizer of this expectation, and the value function is the value of this expectation at this maximum. So what we will do is we'll literally build a regression model so that at the bottom here we can examine, I'm circling here, a regression model, we can examine the outcome of that patient given AK and these other values. And the key part of the regression that we care about is the role of AK. And we can do this because we have data at that last time point collected AK minus bar K minus 1 SK bar. We have all that data for a number of patients. And if we have sufficient patients at this last look, we can do basically a regression model or something like that, or the A-learning style approach. And we can estimate things at that last look. And that was the main thing we'll start with. And so we could literally use basically the equivalent of classification or regression at this last look. That's fairly traditional statistically. But what we do with it as we go backwards is what makes reinforcement learning quite unique. But we have to be able to do this last analysis, meaning we have to have enough patients at this last look to get this to work. If things happen where we don't have that, we can rearrange the data and maybe not use that last look, but go back a little bit earlier. And we can do that in various ways. Okay, and so that's the idea of that last look. And we can get that, when we do that sort of modeling, we can get an estimation for that rule. We get an estimate of the value of that last rule. Sometimes we don't have to estimate the value using regression. Sometimes we don't actually need it to get optimal treatment, but this will, to assess what we're doing, we'll need some estimate of that. Okay, so the idea is that what you do is you do that at that last look. And then what you do is you take everybody at that last look, and instead of giving the outcome they received, you replace with an estimate of what they would have gotten had they gotten the optimal treatment. And you built that model, so you're basically plugging that model for that patient's baseline data, not baseline, but the information available at that kth look. You do that, and then you replace it with that last treatment, that optimal outcome, and you have an estimate of the counterfactual of what they would have gotten had they gotten the best treatment. And you didn't know that ahead of time, so you couldn't do it during the study, but now you know. And then you take that value, and that becomes your pseudo value for the next stage of the model. And you use that in different ways. And now you, in Q learning, which I'll talk about in just a moment, there's a certain thing you do. So what you'll do is a series of these models starting at the last look and fitting them as you go back in time. Each time you're fitting this model and you're assured that even though you're examining the treatment possibilities at that time point.
Excuse me, do you know where is the warehouse?
I'm sorry, what?
Okay,
I can't hear what they're saying. Okay, so Ray, what?
Yeah, please ignore that. Let's just keep going.
Okay. What I was trying to say is what you're doing is that each time as you go backwards, you're replacing the outcome with the best possible with the future decisions, but you still don't know the earlier decisions. And so you fit to determine that early decision and you keep going backwards. And what you do by doing this, you're ensured that you have an optimality over the entirety, and you're also taking into account the late effects of treatments, because in that last look, it contains information in that model we talked about, or classification, it contains information on your earlier treatments too. So, and you can prove theoretically that this leads to the correct answer and it can be identifiable. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit now about what the assumptions are. This is our data here that we have collected. We have a bunch of trajectories, I equals 1 to n, so we have a sample size of n, and we have the states of the patients over patient I from time point 1 to the last time point. We have the actions taken from time point 1 to the last time point, and we have the final outcome. And so we would start with, we would use this data, and we can use this data to fit things. Again, observational smart design is much better for this, but observational study carefully can be sometimes used under certain situations. Here's some of the assumptions we need. And these are related to causal inference assumptions as well. We need consistency, and the basic idea here is that the treatment, the outcome that they got, the potential outcome that they would have gotten from the treatment that they received is actually a potential outcome that they did receive. Sounds like that's a technicality, but it's a very important one. SUTFA has to do with stability of the treatment and relationship. The treatment is independent of other treatments received from other patients. An example where this would be violated is in vaccine studies, where if you have people getting vaccinated, there might be herd immunity, and then your possibility of infection is lower. So you're affected by how other people are treated. And so this would be, there are ways of dealing with that, but in this situation, we're assuming that that's not an issue, that everybody's treatment.
Hi, I have something to pick up.
Yeah, me too.
So,
So I'm not sure what this.
so that door, it seems like it's locked. So,
Ray, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. Please keep going. Let me just ask if they
it
can
should be
mute.
the one. So,
Okay. Another important step is sequential ignorability, or no unmeasured confounder at each time point k given the previous ones. This means that the treatment, that we have all the variables needed to determine how treatment was assigned, and that it is random, effectively conditioning on these treatments. And so this is, and the potential outcome, the actual assignment of the treatment did not change the potential outcome of what they would have received had they gotten that treatment. So this no unmeasured confounders, sequential ignorability is very key and very hard to have. And there's a positivity result in here that is related to this, that tells us that there's a probability that each person did get each of the treatments that are feasible for them. Okay, so let's see, how am I doing? I've got to wrap things up. I'm going to just quickly say that Q-learning at a high level is doing regression models, starting with the last regression model I mentioned earlier, getting that new pseudo value, going to the next time point, doing another regression model with that pseudo value that we estimated as the outcome, then optimizing there for that treatment, and then keep going back, replacing at each point in time the future patient outcome with it, that they're getting the optimal treatment in the future. And you can do this all the way back to the first. And using your regression models each step is the basics of Q-learning. A-learning is the idea of not modeling that whole complex regression model that we're describing, but only model what are called the differences between the two treatment groups. And so I'm gonna, since we're kind of out of time, I'm just gonna say that A-learning focuses on the differences and focusing the model there instead of the actual entire regression model. But it still has a backward induction structure, and the basic premise of looking at going backwards and optimizing as you go, since you already learned from the current model, is done here, backward induction. These is called, that difference, the contrast is called the optimal blip to zero by Robbins. It's also called it's also the regret function, Susan Murphy. A-learning includes G-estimation and marginal means and various other types of methods that have been used more in epidemiology, but they are forms of A-learning. Okay, I'm gonna kind of skip these details and just talk about a high-level comparison to get close to wrap it up. Q-learning and A-learning are both approaches to solving dynamic programming problems using backward induction. They work under reasonable assumptions and moderate sample sizes. you can use with the hundreds instead of hundreds of thousands or thousands. And the fundamental difference is what is modeled in order to change the optimal policy. Q-learning models a little more of the regression, A-learning models the contrast or the interaction effect or the difference between the two treatments. And when Q functions are correctly specified, you're using all of the data, so some can argue that sometimes that's more efficient than A-learning. On the other hand, if you mismodel some of the Q functions, A-learning may be more robust under certain settings. Not always, but under certain settings. So Q-learning has practical advantages in the sense it's really easy to introduce it to people because you just have to use regression, and you can use random forests or other regressions at each of these steps. But it can be, but it can have challenges, as we mentioned before, where A-learning can be advantageous if you don't want to model all aspects of the data. Okay, so that's really all I have, just a high-level discussion of these two.
Thank you, Michael. It's really great. How about let's move directly to the questions. I think we have 4 questions on the screen.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the questions, if that's okay.
So let me read them. The question, first